Today is Tuesday, 8th October, and we still wait to see whether there is going to be a major air or missile strike by Israel against Iran. The Iranians launched their missile strike against Israel some days ago. There's been a certain amount of time has passed since then. There have been defiant statements from Israel which appear to promise a devastating counterstrike. We were getting lots of reports of discussions about this counterstrike by the in the United States, in the US media and in the Israeli media, and there was supposed to be intense discussions between the Americans and the Israelis about that strike on Iran, but the days have passed and it hasn't happened. Now, that again begs the question why. And here I'm going to say that it's in some ways more difficult to understand why there would be a delay in an Israeli strike against Iran as opposed to the delay in the Iranian strike against Israel. As everyone recalls, I'm sure we all recall, some months ago, the Israelis, everybody assumes it was the Israelis, and I've no doubt that was the case, organized the assassination or carried out the assassination of the Hamas political chief, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran on the same day that President Pezeshkian was inaugurated president of Iran. The Iranians were upset and humiliated by that event. There was lots of statements and promises by Iranian officials that a major strike on Israel would take place. The days and the weeks passed. The Iranians continued to insist that there would be a strike against Israel, but no such strike took place. There were lots of reports of growing exasperation on the part of the various Shia militias around the Middle East, aligned with Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon first and foremost. There were reports of angry meetings between Iranian officials and representatives of these Shia militias, in which the Iranians tried to justify their decision, holding back from their strike against Israel. But no such strike took place until a few days ago, when basically the Iranians' hands were forced because of the Israeli attacks, the pager attacks in Lebanon, the bombing and missile strikes in Lebanon, and then ultimately the assassination, the successful assassination by Israel of the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. And at that point, Iranian credibility was clearly on the line, and the Iranians took the decision that they had no choice but to conduct a missile strike, and a missile strike duly took place. Well, some of us, I myself, was surprised that it took so long for that missile strike to happen. But one can see explanations for it. First of all, I admit I underestimated the degree of disagreement within Iran. It appears that President Pezeshkian, who was elected on promises to try to improve or at least to mitigate the conflict between Iran and the Western powers, and he was seeking apparently some degree of sanctions relief from the West and perhaps a resumption of the nuclear negotiations. Anyway, it seems that he definitely acted within Tehran as a strong advocate for restraint on the part of Iran in the face of all of these actions. Secondly, I suggested that Iran's regional allies, Russia and China, would also, at this particular point in time, have advised Iran to act with restraint. In the case of both of these countries, they have achieved over the last couple of years a major process in BRICS construction. The BRICS states are due to have a key summit meeting in Kazan, in Russia, in just 2 weeks' time. Iran, as a new BRICS state, is expected to participate and to participate fully. And in advance of Iran's decision to join the BRICS, the Russians and the Chinese managed to get a rapprochement, at least the Chinese, I should say, make it very clear, because the Chinese managed to broker a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that paved the way for Iran to join the BRICS. But of course, Saudi Arabia is also at least a partner of the BRICS, and in fact my own understanding is that despite some attempts to pretend otherwise, it is now effectively, or in fact, a BRICS state. Saudi Arabia is due to attend or to send representatives to the BRICS summit meeting in Kazan. The Russians and the Chinese would not want a situation where the entire Middle East was exploding, where there was a major conflict between Iran and Israel, where Saudi Arabia might feel forced to pick sides and to take positions which might, given the history of its difficult relations with Iran, tilt more towards the US side and the Israeli side than Iran itself. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese would absolutely not want an uncontrolled escalation of a conflict in the Middle East, which might cause the Iranians to start placing restrictions on oil exports through the Gulf of Hormuz, but through the Straits of Hormuz, something which would affect oil prices in other BRICS states, specifically China and India, but which would also create major stresses. In fact, would be all but guaranteed to lead to a collapse in the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the Russians and the Chinese would have good reason to advise Iran to exercise restraint, and a whole succession of Russian officials, key Russian officials, have visited Iran over the last few weeks, including Sergei Shoigu, the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, who has been there at least twice and who I have speculated might have been there privately significantly more often. And other Russian officials have been there as well, including Russia's Prime Minister Mishustin, who was there about a week ago at the head of a strong delegation that was sent from Russia. So the Russians, Chinese, urging restraint on the Iranians. The Iranians would need the support of these two powerful countries if they were to find themselves in an open-ended confrontation with Israel and the West. And of course, there are other factors as well. There are lots of reports and rumors that the Russians have been sending advanced weapon systems to Iran. They have unquestionably agreed a major arms deal with Iran, which includes Sukhoi 35 fighter jets. I've seen no information that these fighter jets have yet been delivered. Iran has received the Yak 130 jet trainers, which, by the way, are sophisticated and powerful aircraft. They're subsonic, but they can be used in ground attack and strike missions, as well as act as trainers. But there have been reports that other weapons have also been supplied by Russia, that the Russians have supplied surface-to-air missiles, S-400 missiles, and their associated radar systems, and that the Russians have taken steps to provide Iran with a sophisticated electronic warfare capability. And again, it's understandable that the Iranians would want to delay a strike against Israel until these defenses, these weapon systems, if the Russians are indeed supplying them, have been integrated into Iran's own air defense systems. So, one can see all sorts of reasons why the Iranians might have decided to hold off, or at least to take their time. With Israel, at this point in time, it's different. Israel has conducted a whole series of attacks against Iranian targets, going all the way back to April. There was the attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. There was the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran. There have been continuing attacks, incidentally, by Israeli aircraft on targets associated with Iran in Syria. And of course, over the last couple of weeks, we see this major escalation in fighting in Lebanon, with the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah and the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. Beyond that, the Israelis have been talking about an attack on Iran for decades. I can remember discussions taking place, floating this possibility in the early 2000s. One would have expected that by now the Israelis would have rehearsed their options, thought through how it should be done, that they would be prepared to do it, and that they would be in a position to do it. And the Iranian missile strike on their facilities a few days ago appeared to offer the perfect justification or excuse, if you prefer. So, why, given that the Israelis have been making all these strong moves in the Middle East, why they've shown that they're not going to heed advice to act with restraint from their allies? They've snubbed the Americans several times, according to American reports. Of course, many people think that those reports are untrue and that the Americans are actually egging the Israelis along. But one way or the other, it makes no difference. As I said, if the Israelis are ignoring the Americans, or if the Israelis are being encouraged by the Americans, it comes to the same thing. There is no restraint from the US in terms of an Israeli strike on Iran, or so it would seem. Prime Minister Netanyahu has made scathing comments in response to warning statements from President Macron of France. He's mocked and scolded President Macron. It seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government are not going to be deterred or restrained by anything that the Europeans say. So again, fundamental question is, why, in that case, so far, no Israeli attack on Iran? Well, let me say, first of all, I don't know. I mean, whatever I get to say from this point onward, it's pure speculation or guesswork, if you prefer. On my part, I don't know what discussions or councils are taking place in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv at the present time. But I'm going to make a number of guesses. And as I said, these are guesses, but, well, they're reasonably well-informed guesses. The first thing to say is that I've discussed how the Israelis, one might have expected, are prepared or have been planning and preparing a strike on Iran for a long time. Well, I think that, but I don't actually know it. It may be that this is a much more complicated operation than any other that Israel has undertaken up to now. I think that is true. There may be diplomatic factors that need to be taken into account. Israeli jets would have to overfly, presumably, various Arab countries. It might be that permission from those Arab countries would be needed, and perhaps it's been denied. There might be other ways that the Israelis could reach Iran. Maybe they could fly over the sea, but then presumably they would need refueling. Maybe there needs to be assistance provided from Israel's allies for that to happen. Conceivably, the United States would have to facilitate that. It may be, just to cut it short, that I am underestimating the complexity of this operation, that it requires a lot more work and a lot more preparation than I imagine, in which case that could explain the delay, and it might explain why there is a further delay going forward. Or it could be that there is in fact more opposition coming from the United States than the Israelis anticipated. The evidence, and I'm going to stick with this by the way, the evidence is that the Pentagon is not happy with this process of escalation in the Middle East, that they feel that they're being dragged into a conflict in the Middle East on top of the already extremely expensive conflict in Ukraine, two conflicts that are acting as a significant drain on the Pentagon's resources. The Pentagon is overwhelmingly focused on the current conflict with China. I ought to say that last week, Sofia Midkiff, a small town voice, sent me a publication published by the Department of Defense in the United States, which sets out US naval plans going forward. And these spoke straightforwardly of the US Navy preparing for war with China in 2027, just under 3 years away. So that appears to be the focus of the Pentagon's war planning at the moment. The last thing they need is another war in the Middle East, which will require the United States to provide Israel with even more air defense missiles, even more long-range missiles, even more precision-guided bombs that will tie down US warships and US military personnel in the Middle East, all of which are needed to face off in the Pacific against China. So it may be that there is resistance from the Pentagon, and of course that resistance might translate into reluctance or unwillingness by the Pentagon to assist Israel in the military strike against Iran, and that the Israelis understand that without that American assistance, the help with long-range refueling, the provision of long-range missiles, advanced missiles, the provision of intelligence and guidance and satellite data, an Israeli strike on Iran really isn't possible, at least not on the scale that the Israelis seem to be promising. So that may be a further factor in slowing the Israeli response down. Then there might be another one, which is that the Israeli military itself might not be too keen on this operation. Israel is still involved in a war with Hamas in Gaza. Hamas has, by the way, conducted another rocket attack inside Israel. There haven't been many Hamas rocket attacks for a long time, but Hamas has now resumed, or at least conducted, a further rocket attack. Hezbollah, for its part, is continuing to launch further missile and rocket attacks on Israel. I understand that overnight it conducted one of the heaviest. The Israeli army is still fighting in Gaza, and it is now fighting in Lebanon as well. There are now 3 divisions, apparently, of the Israeli army, which are active in the fighting in southern Lebanon. They're about to be joined by a 4th division, according to the Times of Israel. That means that there's at least 20,000 Israeli troops fighting in southern Lebanon. Apparently the fighting is intense and difficult. A Hezbollah official, Naim Qasem, has come forward and has said that Hezbollah is successfully withstanding the Israeli forces, that it has demonstrated to the Israelis that its organization, its structure is still intact, that it remains a cohesive and effective military force, that it has absorbed the damage of the last few weeks and come out of that period intact, and that it's fighting successfully the Israelis in southern Lebanon. And of course, it just demonstrated the reach of its capabilities by conducting that long-range strike against Israel that I spoke about just a moment ago. And of course, the Houthis in Yemen have also launched ballistic missiles against Israel as well. So the Israelis need to take all of that perhaps into account as well. And the Israeli military might be telling Prime Minister Netanyahu, look, we're involved in conflicts in Gaza, in Lebanon, with the Houthis in Yemen. We simply cannot afford another open-ended conflict with Iran, an immeasurably more powerful actor than Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis. We simply cannot afford it at this time. And it could be that there is resistance from, as I said, the Israeli military as well. We know that relations between Prime Minister Netanyahu and some of his military officials are strained, to put it mildly. And there was an article some weeks ago in the Financial Times which quoted Prime Minister Netanyahu telling some of his generals that they were cowards. So that might be a further explanation. And, well, in other programs, I have spoken about the shadow of Moscow, that the Russians presumably provide, or may have provided, Iran with guidance and satellite data in order to enable Iran to conduct its strike against Israel. That it would have been difficult, at least I find it difficult, to understand how that strike could have been conducted in the way that it was, unless the Iranians were provided with satellite and guidance data from the Russians. Now, someone has pointed out that some years ago, the Russians actually sold a satellite. They launched and they sold a sophisticated satellite and launched it for Iran. And it may be that it is this satellite that is providing that information to the Iranians. But given that we're talking about a Russian manufactured satellite, if that is the source of the information that the Iranians are using, I'm going to guess that the Russians still have a degree of control over its operation and the processing of the data from that particular satellite. Or it could be, and I think this is actually more likely, that the Russians, with their enormous intelligence, data and guidance capabilities are provided the Iranians with information from multiple different sources, of which this satellite was only one. Anyway, whatever. If the Russians are involved, and as I said, the Americans and the Israelis will know that they are, if they actually are involved, then that also might cause the Israelis to pause, because obviously Iran itself is a powerful country, but Russia is much, much more so. And the Russians, over and above the weapon systems that they could provide Iran, are capable of providing Iran not only with more weapon systems, but with logistical and technological assistance, which, well, would certainly, I think, affect the way a long-range missile war between Iran and Israel were conducted, and might shape events in ways that were not to Israel's advantage. Just saying. Now, that there is some kind of communication between the Russians and the Iranians, we've now had another major demonstration of this, because the Kremlin today has confirmed that on the 11th of October, the Russian President Vladimir Putin is flying to Turkmenistan, where he is due to attend a regional summit meeting of the former Soviet states, of former Soviet Central Asian states. All of their leaders, the leader of Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and by the way, I understand the leader of Azerbaijan, which is, properly speaking, the Caucasus, they are all going to be there at this meeting in Turkmenistan. Now, there are some attempts to claim that this is a hurriedly arranged meeting, that this was a meeting that Putin was not supposed to attend, and that this has all been arranged at short notice. All the indications are that I've seen from Russian sources that this is wrong, that this is a long-prepared meeting between Putin and the Central Asian leaders. It's been described as a working visit to Turkmenistan. Putin regularly visits Central Asia and visits Russia's allies in Central Asia. Turkmenistan technically is a neutral country. It is not part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization or of the Eurasian Economic Union, but it is widely acknowledged that in reality it is a close friend of Russia's. So it's not actually surprising that Putin would be visiting Turkmenistan, and all the indications are that this visit was arranged a long time in advance. But we're getting reports that President Pezeshkian of Iran is also going to be visiting Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan, and that he will be meeting Putin there. So it looks as if the Russian and Iranian presidents are going to meet in 3 days' time at what is going to be a very high-level meeting. And it's difficult to avoid the impression that this meeting between Pezeshkian and Putin on the back of this Central Asian Summit meeting, that is something that has been arranged at relatively short notice, and that it will be a further opportunity for the Russians and the Iranians to discuss things with each other and to perhaps agree positions. It will be very, very interesting to see who participates in this meeting between Pezeshkian and Putin. Will each of these two presidents bring their military and security people with them? Will the defense ministers of Iran and Russia be there? Will Shoigu be there? Will the intelligence chiefs be there as well? If it is that sort of meeting, if it's a meeting that clearly has a military and security component, then I think we can conclude that it is more than just a meeting, a preparatory meeting between the Iranian and Russian presidents ahead of the BRICS summit, the forthcoming BRICS summit. It will at that point look more like some kind of council of war and a discussion about the defense of Iran from potential Israeli strikes, and it will be seen undoubtedly in Jerusalem and perhaps also in the United States as confirmation that the shadow of Moscow has indeed fallen. Anyway, we'll have to wait and see. It's a couple of days away, and the fact that it's happening on the 11th of October, by the way, may be a sign that the Russians and the Iranians do not expect an Israeli attack before then. Just saying. Anyway, there is a further possible reason why the attack might have been delayed, and that goes back to the facts about the Iranian strike on Israel of a couple of days ago. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the strike, the Iranians claimed that something like 20 Israeli F-35 stealth fighter jets had been destroyed. As I've said in several programs, I've seen no pictures of any destroyed F-35 fighter jets, and to be frank, in previous programs, I've discounted that possibility. I'm starting to wonder, I don't know exactly what did happen, but gradually, bit by bit, more photographs have appeared of the various Israeli air bases that the Iranian missiles struck, and we've had more pictures from the photographs from the Nevatim air base in the Negev desert, where the F-35s were located, and from various other, I believe at least one other Israeli air base as well, where Israeli F-15s are located. Now, to repeat again a point I have made multiple times, I am absolutely not a person who can claim in any way any kind of expertise in assessing photograph data of this sort. On the contrary, not only do I find it difficult to look at photographs, pictures of this kind, but I may completely misunderstand the insignificance of what I see or of what I think I see. But it does now look to me as if we have substantial evidence now of lots of Iranian missile strikes on specific buildings in these air bases. In fact, so many missile strikes that not only have I come round to the view, based on my own, as I said, inexpert and unreliable view of these photographs, that the bulk of the Iranian missiles did get through, but that the specific target of these missiles, in many cases, was the hardened shelters in which one would expect aircraft like the F-35 to be housed. I understand that because of their structure, because of their their skin, if you like. F-35s are not housed in the open, exposing aircraft like that to the elements, especially, in a desert region where one presumes there would be dust storms and things like that, would guarantee damage, and that you would expect these aircraft, when they're located on an airbase, to be housed in shelters. And it looks as if these shelters, it was precisely these shelters that were attacked. And you can see places on the roofs of these shelters where it looks as if missiles penetrated. And, well, it could be that significant damage was indeed done to the F-35 fleet. Apparently Israel does not have a huge number of F-35s. I've seen estimates of between 20 and 30. It could be that a significant proportion of these aircraft were damaged or perhaps destroyed. It seems that these aircraft are not in abundant supply, and of course, as we all know, they are extremely expensive, so that they might be difficult to replace. And it also seems that a significant proportion of Israel's fighter jet fleet, apart from the F-35s, is old, and to the point where some Israeli fighter jets, I'm not able to say what proportion, supposedly still rely on old-fashioned, mechanically scanned radars rather than the new phased array radars that are typical of the more advanced fighter jets that we see today. So the Israelis would be very dependent on the F-35s to conduct a strike against Iran. Against the Iranian air defenses, they would be relying on the stealth capabilities of these fighter jets to get through. Other older fighter jets would be much, much more vulnerable. Israel doesn't have large stocks of stealth fighter jets. Perhaps, possibly, damage was done to the stealth fighter fleet, and that this is the main reason why there has been a delay in the strike against Iran. So, I've provided a whole host of reasons. All of this could prove to be completely wrong. It may be, even as you're watching this program, that the promised or threatened Israeli strike on Iran is underway. Or it could be that that strike is going to happen at some point within the next few days or weeks, and that we will discover that it was all because, as I suggested at the beginning, the Israelis need time to organize and prepare what will have to be a very complex strike, much more complex than anything that they've done before. But the longer it takes, the more delay there is in the Israelis conducting a strike against Iran, the bigger the questions, the greater the questions that are going to be asked. Just saying. So, well, anyway, we will see what happens. We will see what Israel does and what it is able to do. And one of the reasons why I have been wondering about why we haven't had this strike by Israel against Iran is because the focus of Israeli military activity at present does seem to be in the fighting against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, with, as I said, tens of thousands of Israeli troops now engaged. And I wonder whether the heavy focus, the continued focus on Hezbollah might be a sign that Israel's had to scale back its plans for a strike against Iran, and since it doesn't want to appear as if it's softening, it's making up for that by redoubling its attacks on Hezbollah. Now, if that is the case, if what we're looking at is not some big surgical strike on Iran, perhaps provoking an Iranian counter-response, if we're looking instead at a slugfest between the Israeli army and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, then I'm going to suggest that this is bad news for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government, because I would have thought that the very last thing that they would want, or that Israel would want, would be a long, drawn-out war of attrition in southern Lebanon against tough Hezbollah fighters, which Israel has attempted several times in the past, and which has never ended well for Israel. Anyway, this has been a long discussion, setting up possibilities and speculations. As I said, I appreciate that some people do get a bit irritated when I engage in speculations, but, well, it is my program, after all, and it is important, as I said, to bear all of these possibilities into account and to wonder, to ask questions about why what one expects to happen has not yet happened and what that might mean. But anyway, we will see. My major sense, my big sense here, is that I am starting, as I said, to revise my views. Or well, I'm not starting, I am revising my views about the effect of that Iranian missile strike. I think it went further and did more damage than I had thought initially. I always accepted that some missiles got through. There was no doubt about that. The media in the West acknowledged it. But it looks to me as if it was a very powerful strike indeed, and it may have drawn a lot more blood than anybody in the West actually wants to acknowledge. By the way, in that case, I think that reinforces the view that the Russians are involved, at least in some way, in which case the meeting between Pezeshkian and Putin in 3 days' time looks like it could acquire a further significance. We will see, and we will see whether, as well as meeting Pezeshkian, the telephone call between Netanyahu and Putin that about a week ago the Israeli media were reporting Netanyahu has asked the Israeli Foreign Ministry to arrange, whether that telephone call does take place. As I said, if it does happen, that could be the single most important diplomatic moment in this ongoing conflict in the Middle East. So anyway, there we are. That is the situation in the Middle East today. A very tense situation still. Extremely heavy fighting in southern Lebanon. Heavy bombing by Israel of southern Lebanon and of southern Beirut. Heavy rocket attacks by Hezbollah and by Hamas and the Houthis on Israel itself. Though, to be very clear, there is no proportion, there is no comparison in the amount of death and injury done. The Israeli strikes kill immeasurably more people than the strikes by Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis have done, at least up to now. I'm going to finish by adding one further thing, which is that there are reports that Iran has now informally warned the United States that though Iran is still not seeking a regional war, if Israel does conduct another big strike, if Israel does conduct a big strike on Iran, then from now on the gloves are off. That the Iranians will hit back and hit back hard and in every way that they can. That they will not act with the same restraint any further. And, well, that is, of course, a sign that the Iranians probably feel that they have been pushed into a corner. It could also be a sign that the Iranians feel increasingly confident that they have the backing of the Russians and of other key regional allies. And of course, it could be that these warnings, especially if that missile strike, the Iranian missile strike, was successful, that these warnings are finally being heeded by the United States and perhaps by Israel as well. Anyway, this is what I'm going to say about the situation in the Middle East. We now have, on the other issue, the conflict in Ukraine, further evidence of the gathering dismay that exists in Western capitals as they sense that the sands of time in the hourglass, which is the Ukrainian conflict, that the sands are running out, at least for Ukraine, and arguably for the West in terms of what it's trying to achieve in Ukraine as well. Now, today, we've had confirmation from within Germany itself that Scholz is indeed trying to contact and speak to Putin. We've had briefings to this effect, which have appeared in the media in Italy and other places, but the German media is reporting this morning that there is in fact a German government source has told reporters that Scholz is indeed trying to get a call fixed with Putin. We're told, and this is a direct quote from this German government source, it is not a taboo for him, in other words for Scholz. The main thing is to end the war. He does not rule out such a possibility. That's a call with Putin. And I would like to reaffirm this, and that we're then told that Scholz would only initiate contact with Putin if the moment is right and the need to send a clear message or a specific issue emerges, which, well, I suspect that all of these signals suggest that they do indeed think that the moment now is right. And this comes after La Repubblica, Italian newspaper, also citing a source close to the German government and the Social Democratic Party, said that Scholz is preparing a peace plan for Ukraine, another Minsk-type accord, and that this did not rule out handing over some Ukrainian territories to Moscow. Can I just say, any reference to the Minsk agreement is going to act like a red flag to the Russians. If Scholz doesn't understand that, if people in Germany don't understand that, then they should. As far as the Russians are concerned, they were tricked into the Minsk agreement. I think I'm going to say that straightforwardly. What happened was that at a time when the best part of the Ukrainian army, around 30,000 men, was effectively encircled near the town of Debaltseve in Donbass during the fighting in 2015. Angela Merkel telephoned Putin, arranged a summit meeting with Putin. She flew to Moscow, met with Putin in the Kremlin. They spoke to each other in Russian and German in a private meeting where no one else was present, not even interpreters, apparently. I'm going to make a guess, by the way, that the Russians will have recorded the entire conversation. I'm sure there were lots of microphones in the room, but anyway, it was a secret meeting, a kind of, well, not secret, a kind of semi-private meeting. Then Putin and Merkel arranged for everyone to turn up in Minsk. Lukashenko was there, Putin was there, the then Ukrainian President Poroshenko was there, and François Hollande was also there. And out of that meeting, the one in Minsk, which followed that previous meeting between Putin and Merkel in the Kremlin, in Moscow, out of that meeting, the Minsk II agreement emerged. And, well, the Russians, of course, have not forgotten that. Putin has not forgotten that. He's not forgotten how he was talked into this discussion, into this agreement, following Merkel's visit. And I think if he gets another call from another German chancellor talking about something that's presented as Minsk III, then, to be frank, I think he's going to be so angry that he will be strongly tempted to slam the phone down. So just saying, I think that if the Germans want to press forward with a peace plan of their own, they not only need to think carefully about what that plan contains and whether it's something that the Russians would be interested in, but I think they need to be very, very careful how it's labelled. Minsk III will not be well received in Moscow, and that's putting it mildly. But anyway, the Germans, Scholz clearly wanting to speak to Putin at this time, trying to work out some kind of peace plan. The Russians showing little interest. But anyway, more interesting, far more interesting, is an article that has appeared in the Financial Times. It's not actually even an article. It is, in fact, an editorial. It's written by the Financial Times editorial board, and its argument, its title is Ukraine's Shifting War Aims. And Kiev is not being given the support it needs to regain the upper hand over Russia. Now, I can remember the old days when the Financial Times was a very objective and rather dry newspaper focusing on business and economic news, but nonetheless still providing excellent and very detailed and fact-based commentary on international affairs. For a long time, for example, its reporter in Moscow was Patrick Coburn, one of the outstanding international affairs reporters of the last 30 years. Just saying. So anyway, that's not the Financial Times we have now, at least not in my opinion. Today, it is essentially a newspaper that loyally reflects what I would call the neocon line on pretty much all topics. It is, however, very well connected, at least that's my impression, to the British and American governments, and particularly to the Biden administration. So when it writes an editorial, it's one that needs to be taken very seriously, because it is one that leaders, political figures within these governments are likely to read, and which, of course, some of them have probably partly inspired. So we are then told that the situation in Ukraine is very bad. Ukraine is going into its third winter of war with the mood darker than ever. In the east, its troops are losing ground to the grinding advance of their Russian adversaries, albeit at a vast cost to Moscow's forces. I wish they would stop, by the way, constantly inserting this albeit, this qualification, that the Russians are suffering huge losses. This is unquantifiable. It's based on guesstimates, which are probably wrong and which are not supported by the media zona data, even the revised media zona data. And in my opinion, it continues to convey a false and dangerous impression. Simply state the truth that Ukraine's troops are losing ground to the grinding advance of their Russian adversaries. If you stop there, you are reporting things as we know them to be. Anyway, that's just me. Let me press forward. With half its power generation shattered, it's not half its power generation shattered. According to the Ukrainians themselves, they've lost all their thermal power plants. They're dependent on a number of nuclear power stations. Those nuclear power stations do produce an awful lot of power, but they're dependent on substations to transfer that power to the electricity system, and the Russians have shown that they're able to target those substations. So again, saying that half its power generation is shattered actually makes the situation look less bad than it truly is. But anyway, it goes on to say Ukrainians face spending hours a day without light or heat in the coldest months. In Washington and some Western capitals, meanwhile, and in the corridors of Kiev, the mood is shifting from a determination that the war can end only with Russia's army driven from Ukraine to the reluctant recognition that a negotiated settlement that leaves the bulk of the country intact may be the best hope. Yet Kiev is not being given the support it needs even to achieve that scaled back goal. Now, before I proceed again, just to restate the fact, it may be true that the mood is shifting in Washington, some Western capitals, and in the corridors of Kiev. But if we're talking about the corridors of Kiev, well, the public stance of the Zelensky government remains defiant. They continue to insist that they're going to fight on until victory, until every millimetre of pre-2014 Ukraine has been, as they would say, liberated and brought back under Kiev's control, that includes Crimea, that the only path forward is Zelensky's victory plan, and that the only acceptable objective is Zelensky's peace formula, which requires the Russians to withdraw from all of these territories. So it may be that in the corridors, people are whispering to each other that none of this is achievable, that Zelensky's victory plan and his peace plan are so much pie in the sky. But officially, publicly, the victory plan and the peace plan remain Ukraine's publicly stated policy. And the Ukrainians always furiously deny that it is about to change. Anyway, so there is a reluctant recognition that a negotiated settlement that leaves the bulk of the country intact may be the best hope. Well, that was true in 2022. In 2023, we're now at the end of 2024. There's been massive disaster and devastation since then. The proposal that peace be negotiated on terms which leave the Russians in control of stretches of territory in eastern Ukraine, or what was eastern Ukraine, is true. May be true now, but it was also true in April 2022 when that was precisely what was agreed in Istanbul between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And of course, at that time, the West sabotaged it. And I make that point because, of course, we've gone through all this terrible agony and awful war in order for the West to arrive at a point similar to Istanbul, but still, in my opinion, far short of it. And then there is a completely irrelevant tangent. The editorial goes on a completely irrelevant tangent about what Donald Trump may or may not do, which I'm not going to spend any time on. We're also told that the Western powers are also grappling simultaneously with an escalating Middle East war, which is, of course, true. And we're also told that Kiev officials fret in private that they lack the personnel, firepower, and Western support to recover all the territory seized by Russia. And the proposal that we're getting is the one that was floated a couple of days ago in that article that I discussed the day before yesterday, also in the Financial Times, that Ukraine allow the Russians to remain in control of the territories they occupy in eastern Ukraine, that there should be a ceasefire, and that Ukraine then proceed to join NATO, and that the Russians are presented with this fait accompli. So that's the proposal, and it's all set out in the Financial Times editorial. But the editorial actually is a little more realistic than the preceding article was, because it says this: the scenario relies on ambitious assumptions. One is that the United States and its allies are prepared to offer NATO membership or the necessary guarantees when they have so far been reluctant to grant Kiev a binding path into the alliance. It would require a huge and costly deployment of forces by the United States and its partners and leave them on a Cold War-style tripwire. And I've already explained that with all of the other commitments that the United States faces all around the world, expecting the Pentagon to do that now is to ask a great deal, and the Pentagon will almost certainly say no. But then we come back to what ultimately is the real problem, and it's at least satisfying to see that the Financial Times understands it. A second assumption is that Russia's president can be induced to negotiate and accept such a scenario. But preventing Ukraine from joining NATO was one of his ostensible war aims. It was not one of his ostensible war aims. It was one of his war aims. Take away this misleading word, ostensible. He said that absolutely clearly. He has reiterated again many, many times. His foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has just restated it clearly in that interview he has given to Newsweek. The US ambassador to Moscow, Bill Burns, now head of the CIA, way back in 2008, reported to Washington that for Russia, for Putin, for the entire Russian elite, Ukrainian entry into NATO was the brightest red of all red lines, the one that could not be crossed. So there's nothing ostensible about this. Even Stoltenberg blurted out some weeks ago that it was to prevent Ukraine joining NATO that the special military operation was launched. So when the Financial Times asks the question, can Putin be induced to negotiate and accept such a scenario? The straightforward answer is no. No, he cannot. And the Financial Times does then go back and say it is doubtful that Putin has an incentive to agree to land for peace talks while he believes his forces can still expand their gains. So, up to this point, despite significant caveats, I think this article, this editorial, does represent some progress in Western thinking. They understand that the war is being lost. They understand that Ukraine cannot regain its lost territories. They understand that a territory for peace formula would be unacceptable to Moscow if it involved Ukraine's NATO entry. But then, of course, at that moment, it all falls apart, because we're then told that the way out of these problems, the way to get Putin to change his stance is, wait for it, increasing military support for Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky presented a victory plan in Washington last month that sought to persuade Kiev's allies to bolster his position militarily and diplomatically and force Moscow to the table. He left empty-handed on two key requests: progress towards NATO and US permission for Kiev to use Western missiles for long-range strikes on Russian territory. Whether the goal is outright victory or bringing Russia to the table, Western allies need to strengthen Ukraine's hand. The Kremlin can only be pushed into talks on a deal that might be satisfactory for Kiev and the West if it feels the cost of fighting on are too high. And any other resolution to the war that enables all a part of Ukraine to survive and prosper will need guarantees of its security. In the remaining 3 months in office, US President Biden and his European allies should bolster Ukraine as much as possible. The aim ought to be to put Kiev into the strongest possible position ahead of whatever presidency prevails. We cannot yet know how the war will end, but if it is within the West's power and interests, but it is within the West's power and interests to help Ukraine regain the upper hand over its foe. It is not within the West's power to help Ukraine regain the upper hand over its foe. If it was, it would have happened already. The idea that the West is simply sitting back and, giving a few weapons to Ukraine every so often and making all these speeches about how support for Ukraine is so important, but secretly isn't really prepared to do everything that Ukraine needs in order to win. It is ridiculous. It is an absurdity. The West has given as much as it can and more in order to try to help Ukraine win. It was the West, after all, that egged Ukraine on to conduct that disastrous offensive that Ukraine launched in the summer of 2023 that brought Ukraine to the point of complete disaster. So, to go on pretending that the Western powers can somehow do more than they are already doing, that can change the Russian calculus in this war, is absurd. It is ridiculous. We see that even when reality about what is happening in Ukraine starts to dawn, people like the editorial writers of the Financial Times always ultimately return to the same default position, that the only way forward, the only thing, therefore, that the West can do is to escalate. To escalate. To escalate if Ukraine is winning. To escalate if Ukraine is losing. If Ukraine is winning, well, let's escalate to the point of inflicting upon Russia some massive strategic defeat, driving them all out of completely from Ukraine, provoking some kind of crisis in Moscow. Or in the alternative, if Ukraine is losing, well, let's escalate. Let's escalate so that we can put the Ukrainians in a better position, so that they can regain the upper hand, so that they can force the Russians to negotiate and get the Russians to agree to all of the things we want at the negotiating table, but which the Russians otherwise would never agree to. It's always, invariably, escalation, more arms deliveries, more steps like deep strikes against Moscow. Mike Pompeo, the former US Secretary of State and former CIA director, told to Russian pranksters, who, by the way, I don't believe are pranksters. I believe that they're working as part of some sort of rather sophisticated Russian intelligence operation, just saying. But anyway, he told two Russian pranksters in a telephone call that, yes, the objective should be to help the Ukrainians win the war in Ukraine, that the way to do that is by conducting missile strikes against Moscow and St. Petersburg. That will bring the Russians to their senses. And then once the Russians are defeated, we can then integrate them back into the West, because we have so much more to offer them than the Chinese do. A very interesting and clear statement, by the way, of neocon thinking from Mike Pompeo. But we can see, again, the trend, the temptation, the irresistible temptation, the desire for escalation. Strikes on Moscow and St. Petersburg. I've even seen in some places, I don't know where they come from, I suspect these are just unofficial people who are not connected with any government, just making things up, about setting off explosions in the Kremlin or something of that kind. That's somehow going to change the situation, change the Russian calculus. Well, of course, it would change the Russian calculus. It would make the Russians angry, even more angry than they already are, and even more determined to see the war through, and even more convinced that Ukraine in any form is an existential threat to them, something which proponents of escalation never seem to consider. Anyway, there we are. That's the problem that we are confronted with in Western thinking today. Yes, they're doing exactly what Eve Smith warned about roughly a year ago. They're negotiating with each other. They're coming up with proposals, far-fetched, absurd proposals. They're saying to the Russians, keep what you have for the moment. We're not going to recognize it. In the meantime, we're going to get Ukraine into NATO, whether you like it or not. And they know that the Russians will say no. And they're saying to themselves, well, in that case, let's escalate even further. Let's attack Moscow and St. Petersburg. Let's give the green light to do all of these terrible and incredibly dangerous things. And somehow that will induce the Russians, who are winning the war, otherwise winning the war, and who we now understand we cannot defeat. Well, that will somehow induce the Russians to agree to what we ask. This is not a policy. This is not a strategy. This is a wish list masquerading as a strategy and backed by that demand for unending escalation, which is what has led us to this disastrous point at which we are in now. Anyway, maybe again I'm spending too much time analysing articles like this, editorials like this. But as I said, the Financial Times is important in terms of who reads it and who influences it. And I suspect that what we are seeing appear in this editorial will reflect fairly closely the line that the British government, the Starmer government specifically, is going to take at the next Ramstein meeting on the 12th of October. I suspect that they will say to the Germans and to the Americans and to all of the others, yes, we agree with you, Ukraine can't win, we need a ceasefire, we need to end the war. But in order to end the war on satisfactory terms, we must escalate it even more with deep missile strikes and more arms deliveries, even though Britain is not in a position itself to conduct more arms deliveries. Only the Americans, by the way, are. The Americans must become even more committed and even more deeply involved, because even though victory on the battlefield is now unachievable, well, escalation is the only way that we can win on the negotiating table that which we have lost on the battlefield. To repeat again, Lavrov made it very clear in his recent interview with Newsweek that the Russian position not only is not softening, it is now hardening. That the Russians now are demanding that Ukraine recognize the four regions as part of Russia. Those were my interpretations of his words. And that they also expect, as part of any agreement, that all the sanctions that have been imposed upon them by the Western powers be lifted. That is what the Russians are saying. Objectively, it is not unreasonable. But of course, Ukraine and the Western powers will balk at it. And I suspect that some people in Moscow, in fact a lot of people in Moscow, would not be so unhappy. Anyway, let's spend no more time on the negotiations. Let's do a brief rundown on what is going on the battlefronts. And, well, there's been, as always, the same trend of news. The Russians seem to be preparing this big encirclement operation in Kurakovo region. They're preparing, it would seem, they're still preparing their attack on Bogoyavlenka near Ugledar. And it could be that a Russian offensive in Zaporozhye region is in the process of being prepared. But as I said, the major fighting, the major battle continues to be in the Pokrovsk, Kurakovo, Selidovo area. And I'm going to say there doesn't seem to have been a huge amount of news from these places over the last 24 hours, but it's clear that the Russians are continuing to advance and that the position of the Ukrainian forces there is deteriorating. It is also correct, it's also true, that the Russians themselves are now definitely saying that the Battle of Toretsk is coming almost to an end. They appear to have captured the entire high-rise building area in central Toretsk. They apparently have reached the last important coal mine, and there's now fighting going on inside the coal mine. And they have also reached the administrative buildings in Toretsk, the places where the city council building is located, the place where the biggest major school, other administrative buildings are located. When these places are captured and Russian soldiers raise flags over them, and apparently there's now fighting going on in precisely these places, well, that's usually a sign that a place is about to fall, even if there is still some fighting going on in places around it. And further east. We've had some pictures from Chasiv Yar. They confirm what I suspected, which is that the Russians are now deep inside central Chasiv Yar, further advanced than many people had assumed. But even these pictures, which have been provided by the Ukrainians, are very, very sketchy. And in Siversk, having recently captured the village of Verkhokamyanska, immediately to the west of Siversk, the Russians appear to have launched an advance on Siversk from the north, from the town of Kremenaya, and they're very close to closing in on Siversk from the north. There's reports of some kind of a breakthrough achieved by the Russians there. My own view, again, is that the Ukrainians need to withdraw from Siversk, and withdraw from Siversk now. In a week, 2 weeks' time, Siversk could be completely surrounded. That is the trend of events, and the Ukrainian troops who are defending Siversk could find themselves trapped in another cauldron. It would be a repeat of the disaster that has just played out in Ugledar. And further north still, a group of forces north has now officially confirmed that the Russians are in complete control of the entire territory of the aggregate plant. In their latest report on their website, they say simply this: the territory of the Volchansk aggregate power plant is fully under the control of Russian troops. Now, what I think happened is that there's been bitter fighting in the area of the aggregate plant for quite a long time. I suspect that the Ukrainians were clinging on to some places inside the aggregate plant. The Russian command, General Lapin, who is the overall commander, a group of forces north, and who has impressed me, by the way, as another very, very skilled officer. He did that which the Russians often do. He decided to lure the Ukrainian defenders in the aggregate plant out of their defensive positions by temporarily withdrawing Russian troops from the territory of the aggregate plant. The Ukrainians fell for the bait. They advanced, occupied the entirety of the aggregate plant. The Russians then unleashed hell on them with massive bombing, tremendous amounts of shelling. The Ukrainian forces were shattered, and the Russians then were able to capture, as they now say, the entire territory of the aggregate plant, effectively unopposed. That's how it looks to me. In Kursk region, meanwhile, the Russians, group of forces north, claim that they're continuing to advance, principally in the Plekhovo area, that they're now also counterattacking in the Glushkovo area, where the Ukrainians attempted to push forward and try to capture the village of Glushkovo. They didn't get anywhere close to it, but the Russians now say that, group of forces north say again, that they've advanced another 1,700 meters. So where and in what form, I have absolutely no idea. So the war continues, and it continues as before. The Russians continuing to grind the Ukrainians down, continuing to make advances. In Volchansk specifically, they now control the aggregate plant. I believe that they have either captured or are about to capture the rubble that was formerly the high-rise building area. It appears to have been obliterated. Volchansk itself, I suspect, is soon going to fall after a bitter and prolonged battle extended by the need the Russians had to redeploy forces to Kursk. And, well, Toretsk, it seems, is also likely to fall, and Ukrainian troops are surrounded in many places, or they're surrounded in the Kurakhovo area and in Selidovo as well. And as I recently discussed, it looks as if the Russians are clearing the fortifications immediately south of Pokrovsk. There is no other way to say this. Ukraine is losing the war. The Economist admitted it about a week ago. Ukraine is not only losing the war, but despite wishful thinking by some people in the West that it can be turned round, the situation can be turned round, despite wishful thinking by some people in the New York Times, and by the way, in Ukraine, I'm going to return to this later, that the Russian offensive is somehow going to lose momentum and that the Ukrainians will be able to go back on the attack sometimes in 2025. The Russians are winning the war in Ukraine, and there is nothing at all that can now reverse that or change that outcome. The only question is whether the terms the Russians have proposed will be accepted so as to end this war now, failing which more of Ukraine will be lost and the Russian terms will continue to get harder. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video, and don't forget also to check out our shop. And if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. I'll be interested to see, by the way, if the Israelis do conduct their strike on Iran, in which case obviously I will have to revisit all the topics that I discussed at the start of this program. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, if they do it by the time of my next program, well, of course, I will discuss that all there. Until then, have a very good day.